So this looks like a pretty chill way to kick back after a long day, especially compared to the image we have of a smoker. But does vaping really carry all that less risk? Does it really work as an aid to quit smoking? And if so, should anyone else be allowed to vape? We've got some answers for you. So let's dive in. There are lots of different ways to vape, but most e-cigarettes deliver nicotine through a battery-powered coil. The user inhales the vapor through a mouthpiece, and the nicotine enters their bloodstream via the lungs. This method of consumption has become popular because it avoids the combustion of tobacco that produces the smoke seen by many as a symbol of smoking. It also tends to smell better than your average cigarette. Many vapers say it smells like sweet air freshener, or bubble gum, or cinnamon, depending on the flavor you choose. That makes it easier to use in public spaces and helps people who want to vape while around other people. It was hoped that by avoiding the combustion of tobacco, vaping would avoid many of the health risks associated with smoking, such as lung disease and cancer. There are a lot of people out there who think that this is exactly the case. But there are still a lot of unknowns. Although often marketed as perfectly safe, vaping isn't risk-free. This is partly because the e-liquids used in vape pens are unregulated in the same way as pharmaceuticals. That means manufacturers can add almost anything they want to the mix, and there's no guarantee that what's listed on the bottle is actually in the liquid. Even when third parties test these products, the results vary. In 2019, for example, one study found that only about half of the THC cartridges sold online actually contained cannabis. Another study found that many of the liquids contained more nicotine than advertised. And a third study found lower levels of diacetyl, a chemical associated with serious lung disease. But what all these studies have in common is that they found higher levels of something called vitamin E acetate in THC vape products. Vitamin E acetate is commonly used as a food additive, but there is no reason to put it in an inhalable form. And it is certainly not good for the lungs. One of the first studies to identify this substance in vape pens notes that it may be added to thin the liquid and help it dissolve with THC. This would make sense given that vitamin E acetate has been linked to cases of e-cigarette or vaping use associated lung injury, otherwise known as EVALI. This condition can cause coughing, wheezing, and chest pain. And in severe cases, patients may need a lung transplant. But even if you're sticking with nicotine vapes, that doesn't mean you're in the clear. Most e-liquids contain propylene glycol, or vegetable glycerin as a base, which shouldn't be harmful. They also usually include some amount of nicotine, though many brands offer nicotine-free options. Nicotine is highly addictive, so using it as a smoking cessation aid can seem like a smart idea at first. But it can lead to nicotine poisoning, especially in children. Symptoms of nicotine poisoning include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, headache, dizziness, rapid heart rate, and high blood pressure. And because we're still learning about how vaping affects our bodies, we don't know if chronic exposure to even low doses of nicotine is safe. Even beyond the stuff that's actually in the vape juice, there's still plenty in the vaping experience that could be dangerous. For one thing, the coils get super hot when in use. The temperature varies by device, but some can reach 400 degrees Celsius. Not only can this burn your mouth if you touch it, but it can also release heavy metals into the vapor. A study published in 2020 found that vape aerosols contain zinc, nickel, tin, and lead. And it's not just the metals inside the device that could be harmful. Anything that interacts with the device's coil can end up leaching into the vapor as well. For example, one study found that when researchers heated cotton pads soaked in flavored vape juice, they released formaldehyde and other toxic chemicals. And then there's the issue of secondhand vapor. When someone exhales, they release particles into the air that other people can breathe in. Researchers aren't sure what the long-term effects of this secondhand vapor might be, but they do know that it contains many of the same chemicals as first-hand vapor. As scary as all this sounds, it's worth pointing out that a lot of it is speculation, based on extrapolating from what we know about smoking and secondhand smoke. Since vaping is relatively new, we don't have a lot of data on its effects, and what we do have is sometimes contradictory. For example, we know that vaping causes the lungs' cilia, those tiny hairs that keep our airways clean, to stop working for up to 72 hours after exposure. But studies have found mixed results on whether this impairs the body's ability to fight off infections. Similarly, although we have mouse models that show vaping can cause DNA damage, research on human cells has been less conclusive. At best, we can say that vaping is probably not as bad for your lungs as smoking, but considering all the chemicals involved, we can't say it's harmless either. And those chemicals aren't just floating away after you finish your puff. Studies suggest that people who vape regularly have lower lung function and increased airway inflammation. Some studies have even concluded that vaping damages blood vessels and increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. But once again, the research isn't settled. Other studies have failed to replicate these results. The problem with much of the research conducted so far is that it tends to focus on one type of vaping, when in reality, there are a ton of different devices and liquids being used out there. Each device heats the liquid in a slightly different way. Some devices allow the user to adjust the temperature, while others automatically heat the coil to a set level. And then there are the liquids themselves, which vary in ingredients and chemical composition. Because there are so many variables, it's hard to draw conclusions about vaping in general based on any single study. That's why it's so important that large-scale, long-term studies get done soon. In the meantime, we can look at what's happening around the world to get an idea of what may be in store for us. For example, there's evidence that vaping has contributed to a recent increase in hospital admissions for severe asthma in the UK. Studies in the US have also found that vaping has contributed to an increase in respiratory illnesses, especially among kids. Not to mention that the epidemic of teen vaping has led to an epidemic of seizures. And it turns out that most e-cigarettes are pretty easy to hack, so they can deliver higher voltage and larger clouds of vapor, which might sound cool, but it makes it easier for teens to share devices and can make accidental ingestion more likely. Because of all these concerns, many countries have begun to regulate e-cigarettes. Some have opted to ban them outright, while others have introduced advertising restrictions, age limits, and smoke-free places. And although no country has banned e-cigarettes before, there is growing support for measures like these. After all, it took years for us to realize the extent to which tobacco was harming people, and we can't afford to repeat those mistakes with vaping. In the end, we can't say yet whether or not vaping is less risky than smoking. We don't know enough about its long-term effects, and the research that's been done so far is inconclusive at best. What we do know is that both are harmful. If you're trying to quit smoking, talk to your doctor about other ways to ease the transition. Thanks for watching Sci Show.